What I've been asked to talk about was production mainly and distributive issues. But before I start on those two things, let me point out another thing which I think we ought to remember because of the way the lockdown operated, mainly as a police operation rather than as a health measure. And the consequence of that was not only that a lot of economic activities were affected, and I'm coming to that, but equally and even more severely, our ability to measure economic activity, that is the statistical system, was also affected. As a result, we have a lot of areas in which the data is incomplete. The most important example of which is that for a whole month, we did not have the CPI, something as simple as the CPI, which can be collected over telephone. And this gets reflected in a number of other areas, and therefore the lenses through which we view the post-pandemic situation and its evolution is itself likely to be somewhat distorted, and therefore any interpretation would have a large subjective element to it. Having said that, let me immediately go on to note there are certain things on which I think there is relatively no disagreement. Number one, production has not only been much less effective than many of us thought it might have been, and in fact, whatever latest statistics we have indicate that this year's production, that is Rabi of 1920 and Kharif of 2021, one was very good, that is the Rabi. And from whatever sowing data that we have, it appears that Kharif is also heading towards rather good. And this is what the national income statistics is picking up, when it is actually talking about rates of growth of 3% plus and 3.5% in most cases, which is more than our average for the last few years. And that's not unexpected, because rainfall, which still remains a very important determinant of our agricultural production, was not short by any means. If anything, in many places, it was excessive. And given that, which is of course the continuing effect of increasing extreme events during this climate change, I think we were going through a good weather situation, and that's reflected in better agricultural output, with the effect of the pandemic being minor at most. So that's one thing I think most people would agree about. Of course, there are crops in which there have been shortages. There have been parts of the country affected by extreme events where the effect, where output may have fallen. But by and large, I think this is something which most people would agree. Then there are certain types of data which are pretty strong in the sense that those data, there is no doubt that things are the way the data is saying. The most important one of those is exports from India of agricultural commodities. Now, what is most interesting is that our exports have zoomed of all agricultural commodities, and where they have zoomed the most is, for example, in rice. Rice this year, we are going to be exporting at least 14 million tons, up 3 million tons from last year, and going way beyond anything either we have ever exported or anyone else is now exporting. We are by far the world's largest. So, taking on from a higher production, it seems to have also, and nobody's going to, the export figures are very difficult. I mean, they're easy figures to collect. And they are figures which are vetted both from the side of the exporter and the importer. So a lot seems to have gone out. So from the production end, gross production and that part of production which leaves the country, not only left the country, but before, of course, leaving the country, it left the field, traveled to the ports, so that the logistics there seems to have happened as well. And this is true not just of rice, as I said, but by and large of most crops that we export, and of things like even a buffalo meat, which has had a huge amount of trouble in recent years. This year wasn't back to where it used to stand earlier, but after a little fall, it is now at levels which are pretty much more than normal. And this is also true of our marine exports. It's true of the entire bunch of exports that we have, sugar, whatever it is. The third point of data, and this is where contradictions might start coming in, and note them, is that in two of its most recent meetings, the Reserve Bank of India has used as an excuse for not cutting interest rates the argument that food inflation is outside the range, which makes it possible for them to start tinkering with the interest rates. In other words, inflation policy as taken by the Reserve Bank of India is at the moment predicated by the belief that food inflation is too high. Now we add them all up. It suggests that, it would seem to suggest that you've got reasonable output, pretty buoyant export demand, or something has gone out, and rising food prices. In other words, are we an economy which is going through a period where domestic demand also is outstripping the more than usual production? If it were the case, then of course, much of what Sridhar said, although that's where I'm going to, would be wrong. Because that would mean that here's an economy which through the pandemic produced and then consumed so much that it pushed up prices. That is the RBI's inflation observations. However, to immediately come to some reconciliation, one ought to note that what the Reserve Bank looks at is the consumer price index. It does not look anymore at the wholesale prices. So its inflation targeting is limited to the consumer price. As I said right at the beginning, for 1 month, the consumer price index wasn't even announced. And it has proceeded to go about it, but the consumer price index can be very, very different from the producer prices. And this is indeed the case. Now, recently, Vikas Rawal and his team have been analyzing the wholesale price data for a very large range of commodities from all across the country. And what they find, of course, there are variations, but what they find, if I've got to actually summarize, is that there was a massive decline in arrivals in mandis in April, which persisted through most of May. It's now gone up, but arrivals in mandis continue to be relatively low compared. So, for example, mandi arrivals in August or September are less than they were last year, except for a few commodities. As far as prices are concerned, there was a sharp dip in prices. That dip continued till about August, after which there is indeed an increase in the prices of a number of commodities, but not all. And in particular, of course, rice and wheat prices continue to remain low relative to what you might expect given MSP and others. Now, the picture which starts emerging from there is more in line and more in sync with what Sridhar described. That is, as far as output is concerned, that is, the production on the field is concerned, that was probably all right. Didn't get affected too much by the lockdown or the pandemic. But when it came to the incomes of farmers, that is, that output multiplied by the price that the farmer might have expected to receive, that could have well gone down. And most probably did go down, because much of this period, the wholesale prices were lower. Then, of course, you have the situation that those lower wholesale prices seem to have coexisted with higher consumer prices. Now, that's also quite possible, and in fact expected, if the distribution as defined by transport, storage, the general logistics side, actually incurred very large difficulties, costs. So that would actually push up the difference between the wholesale price and the consumer price considerably. And that is probably, almost certainly, what did happen. Notice, however, that in this formulation, one thing goes unexplained, which is, why are arrivals still so low? Prices are going up now in the mandis. The arrivals have risen somewhat, but they continue to be too low. It suggests that the output which was produced is now in the hands of people who are able to store. The production was stored, but they have not actually arrived in the markets. They are being stored essentially in the villages themselves by some farmers. In other words, the role of direct arrivals at the mandis, which is something which either farmers do themselves, or there are traders who go from village to village, buy things and deliver it to the mandis, or the adatiyas who do that for the larger operators. Those systems were affected, but a class of farmers were able to actually acquire the produce of the less better off classes in order to be able to do the necessary storage, without which we cannot explain what is happening to production versus market arrivals.
Professor Sen, can you wind up in about 3 minutes?
Yep.
Thank you.
The market arrival story is also in part an explanation of why it might look, as I suggested earlier, that demand is doing well. It isn't. All that has happened is that storage has gone up at the production end rather than consumer demand. In other words, for most farmers, incomes have fallen. Some farmers and some people with the ability to store in rural areas have been able to buy off grain or buy off things and are doing well. Overall, the demand from urban areas is still doing very badly, so that the demand is not being reflected in the mandis, and therefore it's arrivals which are not happening. Looking ahead, there are similar statistical issues. Again, one piece of statistics which we can't quarrel with is that we're having record fertilizer sales. They're really record fertilizer sales. So that people are buying as if output is going to be profitable, and they're all. So maybe there will not be any long run effects. But my worry is that the pandemic is going to leave rural areas are going to leave rural areas with a huge deficiency in infrastructure requirements. And unfortunately, capital investment, especially public investment in any form, has been the big one to suffer. Some government expenditure has taken place, but much of it has been in the form of either cash handouts through the Krishi, I forget, through those 3,000 rupees to the farmers, and much of it, and some of it has been through the PDS. How well these welfare measures have worked is a question mark. And I say it's a question mark because, let me remind you, that 3 million ton exports, extra exports of rice that I talked about, was to hit ports like Kakinada at below MSP. It was not being bought from farmers and exported. Some of it, and maybe much of it, were diversions for the PDS. And if there were diversions, and of course the PDS itself had been expanded because the government had added a whole amount to be distributed. Some of it got diverted for export use. And we know that the coverage for the farmers' income schemes was not fully met. Now, since, for example, Madhura and the later speakers are both going to speak, I mean, both Kalyani and Madhura, going to speak on welfare, I think there is a real issue. The Ministry of Agriculture now spends 80% of its money on handing out cash and less than 20% on actually doing anything about agriculture.
Professor Sen, can we...
Okay. And can we continue with this after the pandemic? Thanks. Thanks, Sridhar. I stop.
Thank you.